Well, good morning, everyone. Um, I came to the church as a skeptic, and I believed there was a God, but I wasn't sure why I believed it, and I certainly didn't know much about the Bible. And I heard many things from many people, and I decided that I had to actually figure out for myself what I believed and why I believed it. And so I find myself always faced with new questions, and I enjoy the search and seeking out for answers when I have questions. And I love it when people have questions too. And just don't accept what they're told because their mom or the dad told them or the pastor told them, but rather I encourage people to, if they have questions, to seek answers to those questions. Now, today as we go through this seminar, it is in two parts. We have 11 till noon today, and the second part is from 3 to 5 p.m. today. And so we're going to deal with several different issues here. And one of them, after we deal with some of the more technical matters, I want to finish with much more participatory time where we learn how to study the Bible for ourselves. And I'll invite you to join me with Bible in hand. We're looking at some strategies, and I'll have you look at some passages. We'll do that together, but that is in the afternoon session. So we're going to look at, first of all, why do we trust the Bible? How do we know it's actually true? And then how can we better understand it? That's the focus of today.
That song really fit well. My life is yours. Let's
Uh,
pray.
I'm not.
Father in heaven,
Uh,
Lord, I thank you.
I'm sorry. I'm hearing another voice in the background, and so on. So let's continue here. All right. So the Bible is, first of all, we have to recognize the Bible has power. It has power to change lives. People become different. Maybe you can identify this within your own life, or maybe you've met people who, when they started to read the Bible, you can see the changes in their life. You can see that they became a new creation under God, that they became someone different, that the rough areas of their personalities began to be smoothed over, that they became kinder and gentler and more patient. And that's what, God does in our lives through the use of the scriptures. The scriptures, God uses the scriptures to change us, to transform us. But also, and the Bible has power to change societies, both ancient and modern. It was because of the influence of the scriptures, it was the influence of Christians in the first century that led to the end of infanticide, where the Romans would routinely dispose of unwanted children by leaving them on hilltops for animals to eat while they were still alive. Horrible things happened in the ancient world. Christianity was the catalyst that led to the change in the way things were done. The rise of Christian ethics, for example, the end eventually of slavery in the West, more than once, actually, came back again, and again it was uh, ended. For example, it was Christians working in Britain that led to the end of slavery. Um, you've heard of course, John Newton's story about how he was a slave owner who, through his conversion, became someone who helped to end slavery in Britain. All right. So the Bible itself, the Spirit of God working using the Bible, changes societies. It was the example of Jesus in the Bible that led to both Gandhi and Martin Luther King, uh, led both of them to actually use through nonviolent means, they transform their societies, transform the ethics and the consciousness of whole societies. The Bible has that kind of power. And I want to tell you this too, the Bible itself is trustworthy. We're going to be looking at these elements here, and it looks like I've somehow forgot it. Okay, this screen somehow got missed. I'm turning it back a bit here. But the Bible itself, even though it has that kind of power to change lives and change society, is a book under attack. Um, I've had the opportunity to talk with a number of Muslims who've come to my church, and we sat down together. They invited me to their mosque, and we sat down together and talked about the Bible and about Islam. And, Muslims are trained to think that the Bible has been distorted over time, has been twisted, and that it does not contain the truth about God anymore. In fact, Muslims will tell you that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, and the others were actually Muslims, and that in fact, some will say that even Buddha and others were actually Muslims at one time and their teachings have been distorted, that the Quran tells us the truth about God and the truth of his revelation. Judaism, for example, of course, has attacked our understanding of the prophecies about Jesus. Hinduism, people like Deepak Chopra, for example, tell us that we misunderstand the Bible and it cannot be relied upon. New Age religions tells us that, guess what? That the stories of the Bible are pure myths that teach universal truths about our divinity, and they don't teach us the truth about God. Of course, followers of Darwin, for example, tell us that the Bible is completely wrong about how it describes the beginning and course of history. New atheists like Dawkins and Hitchens and others attack the Bible, ridicule its ethics, ridicule biblical teaching. And then you've got secular Bible scholars, people who study the Bible and yet are secular, atheists even, and attack it on historical grounds, attack it on ethical grounds. And so the Bible is a book under extreme attack in this age, more so than any other age in history. So, as I said, the Bible, though, shows itself to be true by the power it has to change people and to change societies. And the Bible also shows itself to be trustworthy through the sciences of archaeology, through the ancient writings of other writers that verify what it tells us, through fulfilled prophecy, and through the collection of manuscripts that show us that it has not been changed over the centuries. We're going to look at some of those in detail during this hour. And well, actually, in detail, we're going to give glimpses really into some of the evidence behind the Bible, because it would take a whole university course to look at some of these things. There's just too much to look at. But what about archaeology, for example? Let's start there. And just going to give you just a couple examples of how archaeology supports the Bible. Archaeology, and by the way, I can't see too many people here, but if there is questions, maybe Pastor Ivan, during the course of our talk this morning, if there are questions that anyone has, that you could relay them to me. If you can put it up on your screen, and maybe you can see it better on that end. I only see 5 faces, including my own, right now. Okay, but I welcome questions. We can save some of those questions towards the end, and allow some Q&A after the actual talk. And then this afternoon, much more involved with Q&A. So.
Yes, I would like to tell, if you have a question, people can put it in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they can post it in the chat. It's a little bit difficult. If you raise your hand, it's difficult to see at this moment, since we are having Pastor Roschman on the screen, and I'm not able to see everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But you can put your question in the chat.
Okay. There's also the issue that because I'm sharing, I get a full screen here. I can't see the chat function on my screen. So I'll have to rely on you, Pastor Ivan, to actually monitor those questions. And if you feel free to interrupt with questions as you monitor the chat function for me. Yeah.
I'll check here the chat and.
Okay, great. All right. So, what can archaeology do? Some people will say that archaeology can prove the Bible to be true. This is not the case. That's claiming too much for archaeology. What archaeology can do is really support the Bible. For example, people. Well, I'll give you a few illustrations here, and I got some pictures to show you too. Sorry for those who are on their phones and don't have a camera here on this function. My apologies, but I'll describe what the pictures are. I'll start with this one example. You can read about this in 2 Kings 20:20, where it talks about that Hezekiah, he was preparing for an invasion from the Assyrians. And to prepare for that invasion, he realized he had a major weakness in the city of Jerusalem. one of the weaknesses was that he strengthened the walls and the towers and so forth to prepare the city for the invasion. But the most crucial thing when you're withstanding an invasion is a abundant water supply. And there was a water supply coming out of the rock in Jerusalem called the Gihon Spring, still there today. And that was an endless supply of fresh water. It's the reason why the city was built there on that hill, is because there was a fresh supply of water there. And so people could survive if they were besieged. And Hezekiah looked at this and he said, you know what, this spring comes out, and pours down into the valley, and that's going to supply water to our enemies, and we're going to lose all that water. So he built a tower and fortifications around the spring. And then what did he do? But he actually dug a tunnel. I mean, he had workers dig the tunnel from, it was a 1,750 foot tunnel underground out of solid rock from the Gihon Spring all the way through underneath the city to the south end of the city at what became known as the Pool of Siloam, which you've heard of from the Gospel of John and the New Testament. And how did they dig this tunnel? Well, they actually dug from both ends, and it's an amazing feat of engineering. They dug this tunnel in solid rock under the city, and they met in the middle with just an inch or so difference. Can you imagine that? I mean, they don't have modern tools. They're just tapping in the rock and listening to sounds and doing their mathematics as they were able. And the tunnel does not go straight because it works through some curves and so forth, but it ends up meeting directly in the middle under, dozens of feet of solid rock. And there's an inscription there, the place where the two groups of diggers met, and it explains what happened and who built the tunnel and so forth. It's an amazing thing. You can go there to Jerusalem today, as Leanne and I did a number of years ago. We were talking about this last night. I think it was 2008 and 2012, right? We went there, and we went to that tunnel there. And if you're claustrophobic, it's not the best idea. If you don't want to get your feet wet, it's not the best idea. But it's an amazing experience to look down that dark tunnel and realize this was dug, that was mentioned in the scriptures, was found recently, and you can travel that tunnel today. And I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. The inscription is there of the workers who actually dug the tunnel and verifying the Bible account. So this shows us, the Bible can show us, or archaeology rather, can show us light, can shed light on the Bible, its accuracy. It can help us to understand more about the scriptures that we are reading. It enriches our understanding of the scriptures. It also verifies that it's not made up stuff, it's actual history. So, for example, there's people who secular scholars said did not exist that were mentioned in the Bible, and yet now they found a reference to these people. For example, King Belshazzar, he who saw the writing on the wall. He was not mentioned in any of the annals of the Babylonians as far as they knew. But then, a century ago, I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but they found many references to King Belshazzar, and they realized that he was actually the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, not the son. And what happened to the son? Well, he was off, living in a retreat in another desert community. Anyways, the point is that Daniel turned out to be absolutely correct in his names and the dignity he gave to those different people. And then we have somebody, Sargon of Assyria. History didn't know about him, no record of him. And then there's archaeological evidence that showed that indeed the Bible was correct. And Balaam, he famously for talking to a donkey, or the donkey talking to him. And the thing about this is, secular scholars assume that that's just a fictional story, that there is no such person named Balaam. And of course, they wouldn't believe such nonsense like a donkey talking to people. But then they found an inscription outside of Israel from a non-Jewish society that mentions the prophet Balaam. And now there's no word about a talking donkey, but it does verify there was a guy named Balaam who is known famously across the region as a prophet outside of Israel. And so that's quite significant. I also mentioned, if you can see my notes, the Hittites. The Hittites are a group of people with an empire to the north of Israel, which the Bible talks about, and of which they had no knowledge of about 150 years ago or so. And then guess what happened? Archaeologists have now found Hittite ruins and cities and a civilization, and realize they have a big part in ancient history. All these are examples of ways in which people doubted the Bible, criticized the Bible, and yet have been shown to be true through archaeology. Now, I mentioned one final example on this page here. Caiaphas, high priest, right? Responsible for the trial, against Jesus, along with his father-in-law, Annas. And what do we know about this fellow? Did he exist? Yes, we have reference to him outside the Bible. But, archaeologists, 1990, they actually found his ossuary in his house. Now, what is an ossuary? Ossuary was a bone box where they put the bones of a person after they died. They put them in a tomb like Jesus was placed. And after about a year, they collected the bones because the body was gone by this time. There was no, they didn't preserve the body through embalming. And so after 1 year, the body was completely gone. They would take the bones and put them in an ossuary, a bone box, and bury that in the ground. And so guess what? They found the ossuary, has his name, Caiaphas, son of Joseph, right on the side. And they found his house. And it's incredible to think that the one who condemned Jesus to death, they found his bones, and they buried his bones on the Mount of Olives, and that's where they are today. I mentioned also one more example, the temple inscription. If you look at Ephesians chapter 2, 14 to 18, it says there that Paul talks about how in Christ the wall that divides Jews and Gentiles was torn down through Christ. That Christ's ministry, his sacrifice, tore down the distinction between Jews and Gentiles. And what adds to our understanding of that passage is that in the temple grounds, there was an actual wall with an inscription on it that said that if you are not Jewish, do not cross this wall or you'll be put to death. And it says so in Greek, and it also said so elsewhere in Latin. We found the Greek inscription that actually says those words. It was a wall of partition, as Paul calls it. It was a wall that separated one race from another. And in the valley down below the temple, as archaeologists were digging there, they found pieces of stone that included the inscription that is referenced in the book of Ephesians. And so you have this incredible examples of the confirmation of the Bible story through archaeology. And I've given you just a couple examples. There's so many more I could give you. My apologies again for those who can't see the pictures. I just got a few of them here. And the picture on the left is people going down into the tunnel underneath, Hezekiah's tunnel, underneath the city of Jerusalem. And by the way, afterwards, if you want, you can go on Yahoo and find many pictures like this there. Just do a search on Google, just do a search on Google, and you will find there, many pictures of these things. The picture on the right on the screen is a plaque that the Israeli Antiquities Authority put up there at the place where the plaque was, commemorating the amazing feat when the two groups of workers met together under the earth in that narrow tunnel, and so water could flow and stay within the city during sieges. The next screen, I'm showing you two more pictures here. The one on the left is sling stones. You ever sang that story for children? One little stone took David, and you think of David, killing Goliath with little flat stones. No, not at all. If you can see that picture, these stones are about the size of baseballs, all right? And so when you think of David and you read that story next time, think about it, the fact that David was not using some tiny little pebbles when he took down Goliath. There were whole units in the armed forces of ancient societies called peltists, okay, or slingers. And they would use stones, they would find stones like this, in the creek beds because they were rounded by the action of water. And they would collect these stones and they would round them off and they would use them because, if you didn't have armor, you didn't have metal, you couldn't afford the iron. what did you have lots of in the Middle East? Stones. And so they would often take stones and use them as their armament. And so they would run and get close to these armed warriors. They'd sling these stones at them and run off. And so we have many examples of sling stones from the ancient world. And here's a collection from an archaeological museum of a collection of some of those sling stones that they found. And so these were used in battle. And so you can imagine if Goliath got hit in the head with one of these, it would take him down, right? No question. So again, this is how archaeology helps illuminate and color our picture of the Bible itself. The picture on the right there is a picture of the remains of the synagogue at Capernaum. And again, if you can't see this, I encourage you later to go online and Google the Capernaum synagogue. And there you will see the ruins of the 4th century or 5th century synagogue that's in nice white marble there. It's built right on the foundation of an earlier synagogue that was made of black basalt, volcanic rock. And that is the one in which Jesus himself taught. And he sat down and taught where Jesus made it the center of his operations in the city of Galilee. So the ruins of the synagogue are still there. And Leanne and I had the opportunity to walk through that synagogue, to be in that place. And it really impresses upon you the reality of the stories of Scripture. They're not just, nice stories. They are stories of things that actually happened in history, in the place where, Jesus actually walked. And it's a wonderful experience to be there in that place. And last 2 pictures here. The picture on the left is the ossuary that Caiaphas was, where his bones were placed. And see the fancy, that's made of stone, okay? So it's very fancy, very expensive. It's a Maserati of ossuaries, it was expensive, but he was a wealthy man after all. And the stone on the right there is the actual stone they found at the base of the mount where the temple used to be. And it puts in Greek letters there, it tells the warning for anyone who is not a Jew to do not pass over this wall or your death will be upon your own head. You'll be responsible for your own death, it says. Okay? You'll be killed for stepping over that line. So it was wonderful to find that, just because it shows how, the Bible, it adds life to the biblical text. So if we move from archaeology, and we can come back to that subject later on in the Q&A, ancient writers also tell us some things. For example, Romans, and I'm going to move along a little quicker here, but we have accounts of different Roman writers and Jewish writers who talk about Jesus, who talk about the apostles, who talk about Jesus' death. They talk about that the Christians believed in the resurrection of Jesus, and they met on a certain day together to worship. Doesn't say what day, by the way. It does mention that they worshiped Christ as a God. They saw that he was divine. And so we have many interesting details from enemies of the Christians in other writings outside the Bible. I've heard people say that, how come history doesn't talk about Jesus if he actually existed, if he's actually true? And they just show their ignorance, because there's many writers outside the Bible that talk about Jesus, Roman writers, philosophers and so forth, Jewish writers. Josephus, for example, that is mentioned on your screen there, Josephus was a Jew who was adopted into the royal family, the Roman royal family, because he predicted that the general would become the emperor. And it turned out he was correct, so they accepted him as a prophet. And he wrote a history of the Jews, and he also wrote an account of the Jewish war. And he mentions Jesus, and he mentions James, the brother of Jesus. And he mentions other messiahs that were competitors with Jesus that were killed, and their movements fell apart. And he gives us many of the details, so we know what happened between the time of Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, and Matthew, the first book of the New Testament. And so these writers, Josephus in particular, help fill in the holes, the gaps between the testaments. Okay? And they give us many insights into groups like the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. So again, they enrich our understanding of the Bible and the Bible characters. So the Bible doesn't stand alone here in this. That's my point. So another source of knowledge about the Bible is, and well, the reason why we can trust it is we have many manuscripts from the ancient world of the Bible, because people will ask me, how do we know the Bible hasn't been changed over time? Should we actually trust the Bible? Should we, how do we know that, people didn't, distort it the way the Muslims tell us? Distorted from the 2,000 years from when the New Testament was finished until we have it today. How do we know that we have what they wrote? Okay. Now, the picture that you can or cannot see there, the first picture is an early manuscript in papyrus, which is like a reed, which is a type of paper, and amazing discovery. We have a few dozen papyri. These are made from a reed that grew along the banks of the Nile, and they stripped it and they flattened it and they glued it together and made paper. Okay, call them papyri. And they use that as a writing material, all right? And so we have there a portion in Greek of the New Testament, of the Gospel of John. And then to the right, we have there a much fancier codex, which means it's a book, not a scroll, but a book from the 10th century of the Gospel of actually the apostles there. Okay, so we have writings like this from the centuries of the church that allow us to know how or why we can trust that the Bible's not been changed. And I'd like to go in a bit more detail of this for comparison. And I want you to get this point, and you can share this with others too. You won't remember the details, but maybe you can remember the point of this. I want to compare the evidence we have for the New Testament compared to the evidence we have for all other ancient books. Did you ever study Roman history in school or Greek history? How do we know what they said and what they did back then? Well, because we have manuscripts. We have copies of what they wrote that were copied and recopied through the centuries, okay? So that now we can read what Seneca or Plato or Caesar or Homer said so many centuries ago. But how do we know that we have what they wrote? How do we know it hasn't been changed over time? Well, scholars are pretty confident that we do have what they wrote. But let's take a look at the evidence that has survived. Okay, you've all heard of Plato before, probably the most famous Greek philosopher. His dialogues, which I think I misspelled there, didn't I? So his dialogues there are, we have the earliest copy that has survived is a handwritten copy from 900 AD, okay? Now, when was the original work by Plato actually written? 1,250 years before that. In other words, we don't have any manuscripts for the first 1,250 years of that particular work from history. And we have only 20 copies of that particular book. And they're all, as I said, the earliest that we have is 1,250 years after it was first written. Okay? So that's a big gap, right? For which we have no evidence whatsoever. Was it changed over time? Do we have the accurate? Well, guess what? Scholars looking at that, they do their work and they say, yeah, we have an accurate copy. They have ways of figuring this out. Okay? Aristotle is the second example. From his assorted books, the earliest surviving copy of his works, even though he wrote in the 4th century BC, the earliest copy of his books is from the 11th century AD. In other words, there's a difference of 1,400 years from the earliest copy, the earliest copy to when it was first written. And we only have 5 copies of his works. 5, all right? Tacitus, the Annals, most famous, important Roman historian. The earliest copy we have is from 1100 AD. And the gap between that and which the original was first written, 1,000 years between the earliest copy and when it was actually written. And we have 20 surviving copies. The one writer for whom we have a lot of copies is Homer. his book, the Iliad, which is kind of like the Bible of the ancient world. The earliest copy we have is, well, from 400 BC. That really goes back, doesn't it? But still, the gap between the earliest copy and when he wrote it is 500 years, half a millennium. And we have 643 copies. That's really quite a bit. But it was that important a work in the ancient world. Not just a collection of stories, but it was seen as the history of the Greeks as a people, and it was important to them. And so they made many copies, but yet you still have a gap of 500 years, half a millennium between when he wrote it and the earliest surviving copy. So I wanted to show you that so I could show you this. The comparison between other ancient works and the New Testament. As you can see from this, in the New Testament, we have what I call an embarrassment of riches. We have an incredible variety of manuscripts going way back to the early days of the church that classical historians look at this and they drool, okay? They look at this and say, how come we can't have this kind of evidence, this kind of manuscript evidence for our works? Because we have in Greek close to 6,000 manuscripts alone, dating back from the very early 2nd century. And in fact, in one case, we have a manuscript that is less than 20 years from the time it was first written. Do you see the other ones? 1,000 years, 1,100 years. Guess what? For some bits of the New Testament, it's 20 years between the time it was written and the first surviving manuscript or portion of manuscript, okay? In Latin, we have over 10,000 manuscripts, 10,000 in Latin alone, okay? The gap from the earliest copy to when the first ones were written, about 300 years. We have many other languages, or they're called versions in technical speak, and we have over 10,000 surviving copies of other languages other than Latin and Greek, okay? Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Arabic, Gothic, and other languages besides, okay? And then let's just say, for example, we lost every single Greek manuscript. We lost every single Latin manuscript. We lost every other manuscript of the Bible. Let's just say that happened. Would we lose our Bibles? No, we wouldn't. Do you know why? And this is amazing here. We have the early church fathers and writers and Christians, they wrote to each other. They didn't have email, but they wrote everything on parchment, and they wrote books and they sent it to each other. By the way, the book, as we call it, wasn't invented until around the end of the 1st century. And quite possibly it was Christians that had a hand in inventing the book, as we call it, sheets of papyrus or parchment that are sewn between two pieces of wood, oftentimes, to make books. That was a change in technology, and it was something possibly, even probably invented by Christians. It allowed them to take the different scrolls or books of the Bible and put them into one volume, what we call the Bible, which means the book. At any rate, these early Christians, after the New Testament, wrote to each other. They wrote guidebooks and instruction manuals and letters and so forth. We have over 1 million and counting quotations from their writings. They quoted vast amounts of the scripture. You could reconstruct over 90% of the New Testament from their writings to each other alone, if you didn't have any other manuscript in Greek or Latin or any other ancient version. And so we have their writings, and they've survived down to our time. I have 38 volumes of their writings on my shelves, big encyclopedic volumes. And that's not all of what they wrote. And it's amazing that Christians don't know this. They think, well, you have the Bible, and then you have us today. 2,000 years have passed, and they've heard of Luther and Calvin and other reformers. They know that some of the dark times we suffered under the Catholic Church. But what they don't realize is that these early Christians were real people who wrote to each other, and we have many of their writings, and we know many of the struggles and the turmoil and the problems and the persecutions of the early church through these so-called patristic writers, okay? And so it's worth your while to read some of them and to hear the voices of these ancient Christians. And, one of them, for example, even gives us the description of the Apostle Paul. Said he was a short man with bow-legged, bald, and that sometimes he had the face of a man and sometimes he had the face of an angel. And an interesting description of the Apostle Paul from the earliest days of the church. So we have an embarrassment of riches. We have all these different manuscripts, and this allows us, when there are differences, it allows us to figure out what the original was. So we know with certainty what they wrote, even though it was written 2,000 years ago, talking specifically here of the New Testament, okay? Now, so has the Bible been changed? Let me get down to some brass tacks here, and I won't spend too long on this. But when you look at these manuscripts and you sort them through, and they're available online, you can look at them for yourself. Of course, then there's the awkwardness of having to learn the languages, but they are available to anybody who wants to study the languages and look at them online. You can just see copies and see what they look like. But when you sort through all these copies of the New Testament, there are many mistakes. We can see differences. They call these things variants, okay? Where they compare manuscripts and you can see there's maybe differences between one and another. Now, does that mean that we've lost what the original said, that we don't really know what Paul or Peter or James said? It doesn't mean that at all. Even though there's over 400,000 differences or variants, that sounds like an awful lot, doesn't it? That sounds almost discouraging in a way, but quite frankly, 99% of those variants are meaningless, okay? They're not meaningful, and they don't have enough evidence to be considered to be original. So for example, you have many spelling mistakes. If you want to know how to spell something, what do? You go to the dictionary, right? And you look it up, or you go online and you Google it, or you say the word into your phone and it tells you how to spell something. Well, guess what? They did not have dictionaries back then. They did not have standardized spelling. And so they could, the same writer in the same passage could spell something several different ways. Sometimes John, for example, spelled with one N and sometimes with two. And just like you, for example, if you say, I would like an apple, what do you say? You add a little N to the word a. You don't say a apple, you say an apple, right? They did the same thing in Greek because it just flows off the tongue easier. They called it a movable nu. Nu is the Greek letter for N. And they would simply, add that to, an N, an A, if it preceded a word that was started with a vowel, right? Just as we do in English today. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't back then. And so there's lots of variants. You can't even translate that into English, right? And most of the differences in the text, these so-called mistakes, you can't translate them. Now, let me mention a few things that now, first of all, on all these different variations, we have so many variations because we have so many manuscripts. If you only had one manuscript of the New Testament, you would have no variants, no so-called mistakes, but you wouldn't know what the original said, would you? You wouldn't know if it had been changed. And by the way, that's precisely what happened in the Muslim world. The third caliphate, his name was Uthman, after Muhammad, he actually decreed what text was going to be the Quran, and he ordered all the other ones burned and destroyed so that we only have what came out from his office, from his court, so to speak, okay? So we don't know if there's variations. In fact, actually, we do know there's variations from other writings, from early Muslims, but the point I'm making is this. Christians didn't destroy their manuscripts. They didn't hide any problems. They wrote them down, they shared them around, and so manuscripts made it across the ancient world, and they didn't always agree with each other, but because we have so many manuscripts, we have differences, but because we have so many manuscripts, we can compare one manuscript to another and correct for people's mistakes. Imagine, these things were handwritten at a time when people did not have glasses, they did not have electricity. They did not have corrective surgery for cataracts and so forth. So people made mistakes, and they used candles and ancient lamps using, olive oil, etc., and fat to, give themselves light. And so, yes, they made mistakes at times. And sometimes when they made copies, they changed the text because they thought that the copy that they were using to make their own copy had made a mistake. And so they corrected for what they thought were the mistakes of other scribes before them. The most obvious example is from the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what we call the synoptic Gospels. These that literally means they see together. And it says that because when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what do you notice? Many of the same stories, the same parables, okay? But there's still differences there, you'll notice. And sometimes to get the complete picture, like witnesses at an accident, you have to compare the accounts of the different witnesses. The same is true for the Gospels. Well, some writers, when they looked at the differences, said, I bet, they may have a copy of Matthew in front of them, and they compare that with their copy of Mark, and they say, oh, look, they're different. And some scribes thought they were correcting for earlier mistakes by harmonizing the Gospels. But what they were actually doing was corrupting it. So what happened was, scholars now look at that and they can see where one scribe changed something, thinking he was correcting something, but actually made a mistake. And again, because we have so many thousands of copies in multiple languages, we're able to go back and restore the text to its original purity, okay? And by that's why you have differences between modern translations and the King James Version too, because new translations have advantage of tens of thousands of manuscripts in different languages, where the King James translators, when they were doing their work, and they did a wonderful job with what they had, but they only had a handful, 6 or 7 manuscripts to work with, and they were all quite late. And so the job of textual critics, as we call them, is to sort through all the copies, restore the original text to its purity. And as we have thousands of copies going back to the early centuries of the church, we're able to restore the text with confidence, something which the King James translators were unable to do. And they did a wonderful job with what they had, but what they had was very limited. But what it does do for us now is scholars are quite confident they have what the apostles wrote. And even where you have some odd little differences where they're not 100% sure, those passages do not affect the meaning of the text. Well, they don't affect any Christian doctrine, okay? No Christian doctrine is affected by those little points where it could be one thing, it could be another. It says, let's see, in John, 1 John chapter 1, it says, we write this to you that our joy may be complete. Other texts say, we write this so that, one says our joy, another text says your joy. Whose joy is it? Okay, does it really matter? There's lots of joy to go around in Christ. The point is, the manuscript evidence on that one little text is split. It could be one, it could be the other. We're not 100% sure. Does it affect any doctrine, any teaching of the church? No, it doesn't. Either one is certainly doctrinally correct and expresses the mind and heart of the early writers. So we don't know for sure in little bits like that, little points like that. Okay, so textual criticism is the science of restoring the text by comparing all these ancient manuscripts. And so has the Bible been changed? Absolutely not. So here's the conclusion of the matter here. The Bible that you have in your hand is life-changing because the source of God's word is God's Spirit, right? All scripture is God-breathed and is profitable for what? Correction and righteousness, for many other reasons that Paul mentions there to Timothy. What has the Bible done? It's transformed lives. We've seen that hopefully in our own lives as well as the lives of other people. It's shaped the course of history. It's a powerful transformative book. And God's Spirit has also preserved, God gave the Bible in the beginning, and God preserved the Bible in spite of the persecutions of Christians and Jews over the century, in spite of the hostility of a rebellious world. The Bible has been maintained, has been preserved over the centuries. And so when we look at the evidence, there's no question that we can believe it and we can treasure it as we face our own challenges and tragedies of life. our belief in the Bible is based on a solid foundation, okay? Not only in an understanding of how God has fulfilled prophecies, but also how, he has preserved the Bible and how he has witnessed to it outside of the Bible itself and other writers, how archaeologists digging in the dirt have found evidence of its reliability. And so you can trust the Bible as you face your own challenges and tragedies of life. The same Spirit who gave it is the same Spirit that preserved it for us. Okay? So what are we doing next? This afternoon, we're going to look at these questions. What about the Old Testament text? I told you about the evidence for the New Testament. I showed you some archaeological stuff about the Old Testament, but we're going to look at the Old Testament text. We're going to decide, well, who decided what books to include in the Bible? Okay. We're going to look at, what translations are best? And if you wanted to buy one, get one for yourself or expand your library, what would you do? And then we're going to look at the question of, well, how can, this is the majority of my time this afternoon will be on this question, how can we get the most from personal Bible study? Because the Bible is not simply a book of information. It's a book that's meant to be transformative, to be the agent by which God transforms us through the ministry of the Holy Spirit. So we can know everything you can about the Bible, but if it doesn't change your life, then what use is it? So we'll be looking at those questions this afternoon. So now I want to open up for any questions or comments as we come to the end of this session before we break for lunch, and we'll come back at 3 p.m. for the questions of canon. In other words, which book should be there in the Bible, what translations should we read, and how do we get the most from personal Bible study. Okay? So Pastor Ivan, I don't know if you're there.
Yes, Pastor.
Mhm.
Yes. So thank you, Pastor, for the presentation. So now we're going to transition to any questions. So you can post them in the chat. Let me open up
Okay, in fact, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so that,
yeah, we can see each other.
yeah, we can see each other and I can see if there's hands or if there's
That's right.
in the chat. Okay. All right, there we go.
Yeah, we have this question by Roxanne.
Okay, also just notice that you're all muted there. If you do want to speak, you can unmute yourself too, right?
Yeah,
Roxanne, yes.
yeah, it's there in the chat. It says, will we discuss why the Catholic Church has 72 books while we have 66?
Oh, yes, I pulled up the chat now here. Yes, we will. There is a difference between we will talk about the Apocrypha, as it's called, those 15 books that are contained in Catholic Bibles, but not found in Protestant Bibles. Why is there a difference? We will talk about that briefly this afternoon as we're getting into the question of the canon. In other words, why certain books and not others. All right.
Yes.
Okay.
So if anyone of you have any questions, feel free to unmute your mic and ask the question.
And if not,
Pastor Roschman,
yes.
will we also discuss the trustworthiness of the Council of Nicaea? I believe it is the people who originally tried to harmonize the writings that were all around.
Okay, there's a lot of misunderstandings about the Council of Nicaea, but I can certainly talk about that. What's their role in terms of canonization and the collection of books and so forth. Yeah, we can talk about the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD that was. And maybe I could just say a brief word about it. The Council of Nicaea did not make a list of what books should be in the Bible and what books should not. Constantine, the emperor who convened that council, or at least sponsored it, did not have a role in deciding any such questions. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. The question of that council was dealing with certain heresies in the early church. There was an early church bishop by the name of Arius, and Arius was teaching that Jesus was a created being. He was not eternal. He said, famously in his saying, he said, there was a time when he was not. In other words, there was a time when Jesus did not exist. And so this was the heresy that was spreading in the early church. And that was one of the major issues decided at that council, was to decide on the nature of Jesus himself. And was there a corruption of Christian doctrine? No, the scriptures are what tells us. And these were talked about and quoted. Remember I talked about those church fathers? The church fathers quoted these questions, talked about these questions. We have their correspondence. We have much of their dialogue. And of course, we have the Gospels, which are recognized, the 4 Gospels, that is. They're recognized, they were taught from, they were quoted long before, centuries before the Council of Nicaea in 325. You'll hear from people like Dan Brown, who wrote the Da Vinci Code, for example. He said, there were something like 80 different Gospels that were considered, and Constantine and the others, they chose 4 from that list and made them into a canon at the Council of Nicaea. That's all bunkus, okay? That's nonsense, utter rubbish, and he sold a lot of books, but it's based on absolute nonsense. The Council of Nicaea dealt with certain questions. The date of Easter was another big question which they dealt with in that council. But the major question was around was Jesus pre-existent? Was he eternal? Or was he simply a created being? Okay? Fighting against the Arians and followers of Bishop Arius. Okay? So that was the major issue at that council. And we have letters from that council. We have documents that came, and never once in any of those documents is any consideration given to the books that should be counted in the Bible. Doesn't come up anywhere in all our correspondence or documents from that council. So some of the critics of the Bible try to say that the Bible was a later creation, not the creation of the early church. That's simply not true. Okay. Roxanne, was that, and did I answer you, or did I go off in all the different directions there?
You did.
Okay.
You did. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I will touch on that council later on. We talk about canonization. It's a fascinating story and a complex history about how we got the books that are included in our Bible today. Yeah. Any other questions as we close up this morning? Because if questions occur to you later on, of course, we can always ask them as we have our Q&A session later on this afternoon. So you can ask questions from this morning as well. No problem there.
Pastor, we have a question there in the chat by Nicole.
Okay.
This Sabbath, everyone, if we're not available for the afternoon session, will there be a recording we can access at a later time? Yes, well, it's being recorded on Zoom, so we'll figure out how to make it available. But yes, this presentation is being recorded, and the afternoon presentation will also.
Well, that's good to know, because I've had some people ask me who were busy this morning and were not able to join today, that they want to view it another time. So yeah. Good to hear. If you're making a recording of it, where will you post that? Is it post on Facebook or YouTube, or you just record it on your laptop?
It's a recording on Zoom, so I'll download that, and we can make it available to those means, either Facebook or YouTube as well.
Yeah. So, after it's all done, if you wouldn't mind, then I've been making, send me the link, and I can forward that to other people who have asked me for that. That'd be great. Okay.
We have a question from Lorraine. Will we be able to know about the other books that other church as, like the Jehovah's Witnesses?
The Jehovah's Witnesses are, they don't have their own, they have their own translation of the Bible. They don't have additional books in that per se. Mormons do, of course. They have other books they consider to be scripture, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, and so on. But Jehovah's Witnesses have their own translation of the Bible and their own writings, which are not considered equal to the Bible. They have their own translation that quite frankly is a poor translation, a translation that they've made changes to the text to support their own teachings. you should be wary of any church that decides to make its own translation and calls it the best translation. That's usually the indication of a cult or a sect. Okay. Jehovah's Witnesses have their own translation because they are, by the way, are Arians in that they, not to be confused with neo-Nazis, okay? Arians from after Bishop Arius, they believe that Jesus was a created being, okay? And so they've translated the Bible and changed some things, gone against the Greek grammar of the text to support their own teachings. And this is why it's universally seen as a poor translation, not only in terms of accuracy, but also in terms of it's very wooden and clumsy to read by comparison to some of the more beautiful translations done out there, just in terms of its style and the quality of its prose. And so it's, I have a copy downstairs that I was given. And yeah, I would read almost any one before that one. So when people start to monkey with the text to support their own doctrines, then you have to be wary. And that's certainly the case with the Jehovah's Witness New World Translation, as they call it, the NWT. Okay.
Pastor, I have.
Pardon?
I have a sister that is a Jehovah Witness. That's why I wanted to hear this answer.
Yes. Yes, it's they will tell you it's the most accurate translation, but they don't know what they're talking about. They tend to discourage education as well. The Jehovah's Witnesses discourage post-secondary education. So a church that produces its own translation and discourages post-secondary education is an organization that doesn't want people to think for themselves.
Okay.
You know, to be blunt about it. All right.
Okay. Thank you for the answer.
Yes.
Pastor,
yes.
Can you share with us some good translations to read, good literal translation of the Bible?
Yeah. There's many good translations of there. I will talk a little bit about that later on in the afternoon, but just for now, maybe I could explain very briefly as we close up here today. Let me explain the how translations work. Okay. If anyone here, I know Pastor Ivan does, and I suspect, Lorraine, from your accent that you do also, that people speak more than one language, right? Some people here. Now, you know you can't go from one language to the other word for word, can you? It doesn't work that way, does it? Because there's different rules of syntax and grammar and so forth. You can't go word for word. You have to, and sometimes there's not exact equivalent words from one language to another. Mm-hmm. So translation is always an art and a science. All right. And so you have to, and so it's never finished because the English language and other languages are always changing over time. You know, we don't speak the way the King James translators spoke. That was the time of Shakespeare. All right. Have you read Shakespeare recently to see, you know, it's difficult, right? So my point is this, that there's always a need for new translations as the language changes and as our understanding of the original Greek and Hebrew develops over time, as archaeology gives us new insights into the meaning of certain words and so on. For those who struggle with this issue, especially around the King James, I would suggest you get a hold of something which you can order online. It's the original preface to the King James Version. The original one, okay? It was the one that was written by the translators to the King James Bible, those who did the translation themselves. It's available from the United Bible Societies. And they themselves talk about their work of translation. And they talk about the fact that they stood on the shoulders of others who came before them. The King James was the 11th printed translation, not the first. The 11th printed English translation, the King James. It was made as a compromise translation. I don't mean that in a negative way, but it was made to bring together two groups who were fighting in England at the time, the Puritans and the ruling bishops of the Anglican Church. They each had their own translation. The Anglicans had the Bishop's Bible, and the Puritans used what's called the Geneva Bible, which is an English translation, and that was obviously made in Geneva, right, by the reformers. And so they fought over which Bible was the accurate one. And so the king decided to, King James II, of course, and he said, hey, let's make a new translation that everyone can use and be happy with. And that's the genesis of the King James Bible, done in 1611. But they themselves recognized that translation was an ongoing process. There's others that came before, and there's others who had come afterwards and improved what they wrote. So if you've heard that we should only be using the King James, let me correct that idea. It's a false idea, okay? It's a false idea because we have to take into account all the manuscript evidence. And we now have close to 6,000 Greek manuscripts alone. The King James translators had 6 or 7 only, and they were all quite late. Okay, so we have much vaster evidence going way back to the early days of the church. And so we have produced a much more accurate translation just because we can, because the resources are there. Okay, now what translation should we use today? It depends what you're using it for. I would suggest very strongly that you get a number of different translations and compare them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're not going to, start learning the languages now unless you really want to. Go for it. But if not, just get a number of different translations. And translations vary on one end from those which are as close as possible to word for word. At the other end of that spectrum, you have ones that are much more thought for thought, what you call a paraphrase. Okay, so you could graph those translations out. Some are much more thought for thought, some are much more word for word, and some are kind of in between. To strike a balance between those. These translators are honorable men who are working to, and women, by the way, who are working to produce a Bible that communicated God's message so we could understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I would suggest something like, there's a new Bible that just came out last year, which I recommend strongly to people. It's the NET Bible, the Net Bible. Net is nothing to do with the internet, by the way, although it's available for free on the internet. The Net is the New English translation, and if you get that one, I suggest you get the Full Notes edition. The Full Notes edition contains 60,000 additional notes to the biblical text. And it tells you, whenever there's a difference in manuscript, it tells you, and it tells you why it chose the one it did. It gives you notes about understanding the text. And so it's a wonderful resource done by a group of biblical scholars. And so it's a beautiful literal translation that can be used as a primary study Bible. So here's, if I had to draw this to a close here, what I'm saying is get yourself some very much more word for word translations, okay? Like the New American Standard Bible, the NASB, that's a very literal word for word translation. The Net Bible, the NET Bible, is also quite literal, but it does, where it departs from that, it tells you the literal meaning in some of the footnotes, so you can see for yourself. The middle of the road translation, which is the first one in history to outsell the King James, is the NIV, the New International Version. And that's extremely popular. And it was also done with the help of English scholars so that it flows well for public reading without any confusion. All right? And it's international in that it was done by a panel of scholars from different English-speaking countries. So it doesn't reflect American or British English or Canadian English or Australian English, but truly international. And it was made by scholars of different denominations so that it avoids any denominational bias. Deborah, you had your hand up there, yes.
Yes, Pastor, thank you for the presentation. Considering the NIV, I have one, and several times when former pastors were preaching, they say to go to a certain text, and when I go there, there were missing verses. So
Okay, yes. I touched on that before, but let me explain that in more detail because that's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, right? There are a few verses that are missing from modern translations that are found in the King James. And so those who look at that, some people are tempted to say, oh, there was a conspiracy to change our Bibles and that sort of thing. That's simply not true. Let me ask you the question. What should be the biblical standard? A 17th century Anglican translation, or what the actual Greek and Hebrew writers wrote? When I put the question that way, the answer is kind of obvious, isn't it? And so modern translation go back and use the earliest manuscripts. What they're doing is restoring the text to its original purity. Remember I talked about how there's so many variants in the manuscripts? So over the centuries, you have things never get lost from the Bible. They tend to get added to the Bible, little bits here and there. And I could go into examples sometime this afternoon if people want to do that. But those verses sometimes are, you may find a verse that's in Matthew, but not in Luke. But in the King James, it's both in Matthew and Luke. Okay, right? And you'll find examples of that. That's an example what I was talking about when I said that sometimes scribes, when they took out their copy of Matthew and their copy of Luke, for example, they compared them, they realized that, oh, there's a verse in Matthew in that same place that's not found in Luke. Maybe an earlier scribe made a mistake and left that out, and so they added in. But when they think they're correcting the manuscripts, they're actually corrupting them from their original purity. Now, so what really matters is what the originals wrote, not some of the little bits that got added over 1,000 years or more and found their way into the King James Bible. Okay, so as the more evidence we find, the more we are able to zero in accurately on the original text. Now, those little differences that you mentioned between some translations and others, between modern translations and the King James or some of the ancient ones like the Geneva Bible and so on, is that none of these verses make any difference in terms of Christian teaching or doctrine. Okay, not
You
one. Go ahead, Leanne.
I was just going to say, you might want to mention the one about the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in, the one that was.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Right.
Because that's the one that most people get upset about. Okay.
Yes. All right. I'll try to make this as brief and as clear as possible. There's a famous example of in 1 John 5, 7, and 8, you have what's called the Comma Johannem. This is this text that says, there are three in heaven that bear witness, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. These three are one and these three agree. You won't find that text in modern translations at all. Why? For the simple reason is it's not found in any manuscript before the 14th century, okay? Or before that, or even after that. It's found, it appears in a Latin text, the Catholic translation of the Bible, the Vulgate. It appears in the margin, as an extra note, in the margin of a Latin copy of the Vulgate, an earlier edition. And then in later edition, we can see it being added to the Latin text, the Vulgate. But it's not found in any Greek manuscript. So when the great Belgian scholar Erasmus, when he was putting out a Greek text for people to use and study from, he did not include that text. And people jumped on him and attacked him and says, you're cutting verses out of our Bible. He says, wait a minute. We don't have any Greek manuscripts that include that verse. So obviously it wasn't part of the original. And it was only found in the Latin, the Catholic Bible. So we should not include it in our Greek Bible or any other translation of our Greek Bible. That's why it's not there. Now, here's the thing. He said this, look, if you can show me just one Greek manuscript that includes that verse, I will put it back in my text. Okay? Guess what? Some Irish monk came over and says, hey, I got one. And Erasmus says, I think you made that for the occasion because it was very late. Obviously, it was something that was hot off the press, so to speak. So this Irish monk was just wrote this down so that he could force Erasmus to keep his promise, and he did. And that's why it made it into Erasmus's next edition. And from there, it made its way into the King James, even though Erasmus put a long footnote at the bottom saying how he strongly suspected that particular Greek manuscript that Irish monk gave to him was a forgery. Okay? So it's a complex history. In fact, do you know who outlines this history for us? If you have the old standard set of Adventist commentaries, you know, those ones from years ago, if you look at First John in that place, it actually tells you a bit of the story there, of that story that's found in your commentary series. You can look it up there. So the point of the matter is, number one, it's not found in the earliest manuscripts going back over 1,000 years. Therefore, to be honest about it, to show integrity, we cannot include it in our Greek, in our Bibles, our English Bibles today. At the same time, the early church came to a clear understanding of the Trinity without having that text at all. It's not necessary for the Trinity. It's not an attempt to destroy the Trinity by leaving it out. We have the records of their church councils where they debated this thing. By the way, that verse is never quoted because it didn't exist. And they came to the conclusion of the Trinity without that text altogether. Okay? So does that clarify that at all? It's all these textual questions, when you see a verse quote unquote missing, what you're seeing is a restoration to the original purity of the text. Because in no way should we make the King James or any of these early translations the standard by which we judge modern translations. And modern translations have the wonderful advantage and privilege of having thousands of more ancient copies going far back in the history of the church.
Amen.
Something King James translators never could do. And so they did a wonderful job with what they had, but what they had was very limited. And by the way, I should say this for the King James. It had a powerful influence on the English language. It actually helped to form there's many words that appear for the first time in Shakespeare. Interesting enough. And so it helped to shape the English language. Words appeared in the King James and Shakespeare that have helped shape the English language. And some of the phrases we use today, he's the apple of my eye, for example, that's an expression that is not literally in the Greek text, okay? But it's an expression that appears in the King James, and we still use it today. So it's influenced the idioms we use, the words that we use. It's a cultural milestone. It shaped art and society in many ways. So I'm not in any way speaking against the King James, but we have to understand it for what it is, not what it's not.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other final comments or questions this morning before we close up and take our lunch break?
No.
Okay. So we will then, Pastor Ivan.
Yes, thank you, Pastor. And we can pray and dismiss right now for lunch, and we'll be back at 3 p.m. to continue with this seminar. Thank you so much. It's just really interesting. I personally, I am blessed to hear your presentation, and I'm sure everyone here too. So let's pray together to close our presentation. Our Heavenly Father, thank you for your word, because you have preserved it for us to be able to learn more about you and to get to know you. Thank you because in the pages of the Bible we can learn about you and find salvation. Please be with us and continue to bless us as we come back at 3 to continue studying. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.